You are not free. You never have been. Every day you wake up and perform elaborate rituals of self-betrayal, molding yourself into shapes that others find acceptable, suppressing thoughts they might find disturbing, and pursuing dreams they've approved as worthy of pursuit. You call this living, but Carl Jung understood what it really is: psychological slavery disguised as social virtue. Tonight, we confront the most devastating truth about human existence. Your desperate need for others' approval is the prison that prevents you from ever discovering who you actually are. If you want freedom, you must stop seeking approval. In the depths of human psychology lies a paradox that destroys most people before they even recognize its existence. The more desperately you seek others' approval, the further you drift from your authentic self. The more you try to be loved by everyone, the less capable you become of loving yourself. The more you conform to others' expectations, the more you become a stranger to your own deepest truths and most powerful capabilities. Tonight, we descend into the psychological underworld, where Carl Jung spent decades mapping the terrain of human consciousness, where he discovered that the path to authentic freedom requires not the accumulation of social approval, but its systematic abandonment. We will explore how your persona, the carefully crafted mask you wear for social acceptance, has become your psychological prison, how your need for external validation has replaced your capacity for internal authority, and why the journey toward authentic selfhood necessarily involves disappointing, disturbing, and ultimately liberating yourself from the opinions of those who would prefer you remain small, predictable, and safely contained within their understanding. Through the revolutionary depth psychology of Carl Jung himself, who revealed that individuation, the process of becoming a complete individual, requires the courage to integrate aspects of yourself that others might reject. Through his insights into the collective unconscious that shows how social conditioning operates at levels deeper than conscious thought. Through his understanding of the shadow, the animus animus, and the self that demonstrate why psychological wholeness cannot coexist with the fragmentation required for universal approval. Through his recognition that authentic power emerges not from conformity, but from the integration of your complete psychological reality, and through his understanding that true freedom is not social acceptance, but psychological sovereignty that enables you to choose your responses based on inner truth, rather than external pressure, we will uncover why your approval addiction has become the primary obstacle to discovering your authentic identity and power. By the end of this psychological journey, you will understand why individuated people appear cold to those who remain embedded in collective consciousness, why psychological freedom requires the courage to be misunderstood rather than the comfort of being universally accepted, and why Jung's path toward authentic selfhood demands nothing less than the complete transformation of how you define success, measure worth, and navigate the complex relationship between your inner truth and outer world. The question that will determine whether you remain trapped in the comfortable prison of social approval or embark on the dangerous journey toward authentic freedom is this: are you ready to discover who you actually are when you stop trying to be who others want you to be? And are you strong enough to bear the loneliness that authentic individuation requires? Jung's foundation, the prison of the persona. Carl Jung understood something that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The personality you present to the world is not your authentic self, but a carefully constructed performance designed to win approval, avoid rejection, and maintain your place in social hierarchies that may have nothing to do with your genuine development or deepest values. Jung called this performance the persona, the mask you wear in social situations that gradually becomes so habitual you mistake it for your true face. The persona begins as a necessary adaptation that allows you to function in social environments, but it becomes pathological when it completely replaces authentic self-expression, when you lose the ability to distinguish between who you actually are and who you pretend to be for others' comfort. The persona operates through what Jung recognized as identification, the psychological process where you become so fused with your social role that you cannot access aspects of your personality that don't fit within that role's parameters. The good student cannot access their rebellious instincts. The responsible employee cannot connect with their creative impulses. The nice person cannot integrate their aggressive capabilities. Each identification limits you to a fraction of your complete psychological reality. This limitation serves others more than it serves you. Your family prefers you to remain in familiar roles that make them comfortable, rather than growing into dimensions of yourself they don't understand. Your employer benefits from your identification with work roles that serve company objectives, rather than your authentic development. Your social circle enjoys your predictable persona more than they would appreciate your complete, complex, and potentially challenging authentic self. The tragedy of persona identification is that it feels like success while actually representing the systematic abandonment of your authentic power. You receive approval for being a diminished version of yourself, while the aspects of your personality that might contain your greatest gifts remain buried in what Jung called the shadow, the unconscious repository of everything you've rejected about yourself to maintain social acceptability. Jung observed that most people become so skilled at persona performance that they lose conscious access to their authentic preferences, genuine emotions, and natural responses to situations. They literally don't know what they actually want because they've spent years focusing on what others want from them. They can't access their real feelings because they've practiced suppressing feelings that others find uncomfortable. They cannot trust their instinctive responses because they've trained themselves to respond according to social expectations rather than inner wisdom. This creates what Jung called neurosis, not mental illness, but the psychological fragmentation that results from rejecting essential aspects of your personality to maintain social approval. The neurotic person cannot access their complete self because they've relegated crucial aspects of that self to the unconscious shadow, where they operate autonomously and often destructively rather than consciously and constructively. The persona becomes a psychological prison when you realize that you've spent so much energy maintaining your mask that you've forgotten what lies beneath it. You've become so skilled at being who others want you to be that you've lost the ability to discover who you actually are when all external expectations are stripped away. Breaking free from persona identification requires what Jung called the encounter with the shadow, the terrifying and liberating process of recognizing and integrating the aspects of yourself that you've rejected to maintain social approval. This encounter cannot happen while you remain dependent on others' validation, because it necessarily involves expressing and exploring aspects of yourself that others might find disturbing, challenging, or socially inappropriate. The person who breaks through persona identification discovers that their authentic self is far more complex, powerful, and interesting than their social mask ever was, but also that this authentic self requires environments and relationships that can appreciate complexity rather than demanding simplification, that value authenticity over accommodation, that support individual development over collective conformity. The collective unconscious, how others' expectations become your prison. Jung's most revolutionary insight concerned the existence of what he called the collective unconscious, shared psychological patterns inherited from humanity's evolutionary past that operate below individual consciousness to shape behavior, expectations, and social norms in ways that serve group survival but may prevent individual authenticity and development. These collective patterns, which Jung termed archetypes, create powerful psychological pressures to conform to social roles that have been functional for human groups throughout history, but may not serve your authentic development in your particular circumstances with your unique capabilities and aspirations. The collective unconscious operates like a psychological gravity that pulls you toward conventional behavior patterns, whether or not those patterns serve your individual flourishing. Consider how this operates through specific archetypal patterns. The good mother archetype creates expectations that women should be nurturing, self-sacrificing, and emotionally available to others regardless of their personal needs, career aspirations, or individual temperament. Women who don't naturally fit this pattern often experience guilt and social pressure that can lead them to suppress authentic aspects of themselves that others find threatening to conventional gender expectations. The successful man archetype creates expectations that men should be financially productive, emotionally stoic, and competitively oriented regardless of their natural inclinations toward creativity, emotional expressiveness, or cooperative rather than competitive approaches to achievement. Men who don't fit this pattern often experience shame and social rejection that can lead them to adopt personas that serve social expectations rather than authentic development. The responsible citizen archetype creates expectations that individuals should prioritize group needs over personal development, accept authority without question, and measure success through conventional achievements rather than authentic self-realization. People who resist these expectations often face social ostracism that can pressure them back into conformity, even when conformity requires abandoning their genuine values and aspirations. Jung understood that these archetypal patterns operate through what he called participation mystique, unconscious psychological fusion with collective expectations that makes it difficult to distinguish between your authentic desires and socially conditioned wants, between your genuine values and inherited moral systems that may not serve your particular circumstances and development needs. This fusion creates what Jung recognized as inflation, the psychological state where you identify so completely with collective roles and expectations that you lose contact with your individual reality. The inflated person cannot access their authentic self because they've become psychologically merged with social archetypes that operate independently of individual consciousness and choice. Breaking free from collective unconscious control requires what Jung called individuation, the process of differentiating your individual consciousness from collective patterns, developing awareness of how archetypal forces influence your behavior, and making conscious choices about which collective patterns serve your authentic development versus which patterns constrain you within socially acceptable but personally limiting roles. This individuation process necessarily creates conflict with those who remain embedded in collective unconsciousness because your differentiation threatens their comfortable assumption that collective patterns are natural, inevitable, and morally required, rather than culturally constructed and individually optional. The person undergoing individuation often experiences what Jung called the dark night of the soul, a period of psychological disorientation that occurs when familiar social identities no longer feel authentic, but new individual identities have not yet stabilized. This disorientation requires tremendous courage because it involves existing in psychological uncertainty while authentic selfhood gradually emerges from beneath layers of social conditioning. Jung observed that most people cannot tolerate this uncertainty and retreat to collective patterns that provide psychological comfort at the cost of individual authenticity. Only those who can endure temporary disorientation while maintaining commitment to authentic self-discovery complete the individuation process that leads to genuine psychological freedom. The individuated person learns to recognize collective pressures without being controlled by them, to appreciate archetypal patterns without being imprisoned by them, to participate in social life without surrendering individual authority to social expectations that may not serve their authentic development or genuine values. The shadow, integrating what others reject. Perhaps Jung's most challenging insight for approval seekers is that authentic selfhood requires integrating your shadow, the aspects of your personality that you've rejected, denied, or suppressed because others find them socially unacceptable, morally questionable, or simply uncomfortable to acknowledge and accommodate. The shadow contains not just negative qualities like selfishness, aggression, and cruelty, but also positive qualities that don't fit your persona, such as creativity that might disrupt conventional career paths, intelligence that might challenge group harmony, or independence that might threaten relationships based on your accommodation of others' needs. Jung understood that shadow integration is impossible while you remain dependent on others' approval, because shadow material by definition includes aspects of yourself that others have taught you to reject. Your selfishness threatens those who benefit from your selflessness. Your aggression challenges those who prefer your accommodation. Your independence disturbs those who need your dependence for their own psychological comfort. The shadow also contains what Jung called inferior functions, aspects of your personality that are less developed but potentially valuable if consciously integrated. The highly rational person's shadow may contain emotional and intuitive capabilities that feel foreign but could enhance their decision-making and relationships. The extremely social person's shadow may contain solitary and introspective capacities that feel uncomfortable but could deepen their self-knowledge and authentic expression. Shadow integration requires the courage to explore and express aspects of yourself that might provoke disapproval, criticism, or rejection from those who have grown comfortable with your limited self-presentation. This exploration cannot happen while you remain focused on maintaining universal approval, because shadow work necessarily involves disappointing those who prefer your familiar limitations to your unfamiliar completeness. Consider how this operates in practice. The person who has built their identity around being helpful and accommodating must integrate their capacity for selfishness and refusal to access their complete emotional range. This integration will likely disappoint those who have relied on unlimited helpfulness while revealing new dimensions of personality that may be initially uncomfortable but ultimately more authentic and powerful. The individual who has constructed their persona around being rational and controlled must integrate their emotional and spontaneous capabilities to achieve psychological wholeness. This integration may disturb those who appreciate predictable rationality while revealing creative and passionate aspects of personality that others find challenging but that contain essential life energy. The person who has defined themselves through compliance and agreeability must integrate their rebellious and resistant capabilities to become psychologically complete. This integration will likely conflict with those who benefit from consistent compliance, while revealing strength and independence that may threaten relationships based on accommodation rather than mutual respect. Jung observed that shadow integration is not about becoming cruel, selfish, or destructive, but about accessing the complete range of human capabilities, so that you can choose consciously when to be kind versus firm, generous versus self-protective, cooperative versus independent, based on what circumstances require, rather than being limited to responses that others find comfortable. The shadow-integrated person becomes more authentically kind because their kindness is chosen rather than compulsive, more genuinely strong because their strength includes both gentleness and firmness, more truly loving because their love includes both acceptance and appropriate boundaries. This integration creates what Jung called psychological wholeness, the state where you have conscious access to your complete personality, rather than being limited to socially acceptable fragments. Wholeness enables authentic choice about how to respond to different situations based on wisdom rather than fear, internal authority rather than external pressure, genuine values rather than inherited expectations. The person who achieves shadow integration discovers that they become more attractive to psychologically healthy people who appreciate complexity and authenticity, while becoming less appealing to those who prefer simple, predictable, and controllable personalities that serve their psychological needs rather than offering genuine relationship. The individuation process, becoming yourself. Jung's concept of individuation represents perhaps the most comprehensive map ever created for the journey from social conformity to authentic selfhood. This process involves not just discovering who you are beneath social conditioning, but actively becoming that person despite social pressure to remain limited to familiar, comfortable, and socially acceptable versions of yourself. Individuation begins with what Jung called the call, a growing sense that your current life, despite meeting social expectations and perhaps achieving conventional success, feels increasingly empty, restrictive, or inauthentic. This call often manifests as depression, anxiety, or existential crisis that cannot be resolved through external achievements or social approval because it represents your authentic self demanding expression and integration. Many people experience this call but respond by seeking more approval, better relationships, or greater achievements rather than recognizing it as an invitation to psychological development that requires moving beyond the need for external validation toward internal authority and authentic self-expression. The first stage of individuation involves what Jung called the separation from the collective, the gradual recognition that your values, desires, and life direction may not align with family expectations, social norms, or cultural definitions of success and fulfillment. This separation requires the courage to disappoint others rather than disappoint yourself, to risk social rejection rather than accept continued self-rejection. This separation often feels like betrayal because it involves questioning loyalties, traditions, and relationships that have provided identity and belonging throughout your development. The person beginning individuation must choose between maintaining others' comfort and pursuing their own authenticity, between preserving familiar relationships and discovering unknown aspects of themselves. The second stage involves what Jung called the encounter with the shadow, the systematic exploration and integration of rejected aspects of personality that have been suppressed to maintain social approval. This encounter requires facing not just negative qualities you've denied, but positive qualities you've hidden because they threaten others' comfort with your limitation. Shadow work often reveals that many of your supposed weaknesses contain essential strengths that have been underdeveloped due to social pressure. Your selfishness may contain healthy self-care capabilities. Your aggression may contain assertiveness skills necessary for boundary setting and goal achievement. Your independence may contain leadership qualities that require solitude for development. The third stage involves what Jung called the encounter with the anima/animus, the integration of psychological qualities traditionally associated with the opposite gender that have been suppressed due to social gender expectations. This integration allows access to complete human capabilities rather than being limited to gender stereotypical responses that may not serve your authentic development or circumstances requiring different approaches. For men, this might involve integrating emotional intelligence, nurturing capabilities, and collaborative approaches that have been suppressed due to masculine stereotypes, emphasizing stoicism, competition, and independence. For women, this might involve integrating assertiveness, strategic thinking, and independent achievement drives that have been suppressed due to feminine stereotypes, emphasizing accommodation, cooperation, and relationship maintenance. The final stage involves what Jung called the realization of the self, the integration of conscious and unconscious elements into a unified personality that can respond to life circumstances with wisdom rather than conditioning, authenticity rather than performance, internal authority rather than external dependence. The individuated person has developed what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposing psychological elements in creative tension rather than resolving them through the elimination of aspects that others find uncomfortable. They can be both kind and firm, independent and connected, rational and emotional according to what circumstances require, rather than being limited to responses that maintain social approval. This integration creates psychological freedom because it eliminates internal conflict between authentic self-expression and social expectation. The individuated person can maintain appropriate social relationships while remaining true to their authentic values, can adapt to different environments while maintaining core identity, can consider others' perspectives while trusting their own judgment. Most importantly, individuation creates the psychological foundation for genuine contribution to others and society because it emerges from wholeness rather than fragmentation, authenticity rather than performance, strength rather than need for approval. The individuated person can serve others from choice rather than compulsion, from abundance rather than desperation for validation. The loneliness of authentic living. Jung understood that individuation comes with a cost that most people find unacceptable, what he called the loneliness of the individuated person. This loneliness emerges not from being antisocial, but from no longer being able to maintain relationships that require your limitation, accommodation of others' dysfunctional patterns, or participation in collective illusions that prevent authentic connection and mutual development. The individuated person often finds that they can no longer tolerate superficial social interactions that avoid authentic topics, meaningful relationships that require persona performance rather than genuine self-expression, or group activities that serve collective comfort rather than individual growth. This creates social isolation that can feel devastating until you develop relationships that appreciate authenticity over accommodation. This loneliness is particularly challenging because it cannot be resolved by returning to previous patterns of social connection that required your limitation. Once you've experienced authentic selfhood, persona performance feels like psychological death. Once you've integrated your shadow, living according to others' comfort requirements feels like betraying your essential nature. Once you've accessed internal authority, depending on external validation feels like voluntary slavery. The loneliness is also intensified by the reality that most people cannot relate to individuated consciousness because they remain embedded in collective patterns, dependent on external approval, and identified with personas that prevent access to their authentic selves. The individuated person often feels like they're speaking a different language, even when using the same words as those who remain psychologically unconscious. Jung observed that this loneliness serves an important function in psychological development because it creates space for authentic self-relationship to develop without the constant pressure to accommodate others' expectations or maintain social appearances that prevent deep self-knowledge. The individuated person learns to enjoy their own company, to value their own thoughts and feelings, to trust their own judgment even when others disagree. However, Jung also recognized that complete isolation is neither necessary nor healthy for individuated people. The goal is not to become hermits, but to develop the capacity for selective relationship, deep connections with others who appreciate authenticity, who have done their own psychological work, who can engage in mutual development rather than requiring one-sided accommodation. These authentic relationships are qualitatively different from conventional social connections because they're based on genuine compatibility rather than social expectation, mutual growth rather than collective comfort, individual authenticity rather than persona performance. They often develop slowly as individuated people recognize each other through shared commitment to authentic living rather than social conformity. The individuated person also discovers that they can maintain appropriate relationships with less developed individuals without sacrificing their authenticity or returning to accommodating patterns. They learn to interact with others at whatever level of consciousness those others can handle, while maintaining internal authority and authentic self-expression. This selective approach to relationships creates what Jung called right relationship, connections that serve mutual development rather than mutual limitation, that support individual authenticity rather than requiring individual constraint, that enhance life rather than managing comfort. The loneliness of individuation ultimately transforms into what Jung called solitude, the capacity to be alone without being lonely, to value internal relationship as much as external connection, to find satisfaction in authentic self-expression even when that expression is not universally understood or appreciated. This solitude becomes a source of strength rather than isolation because it provides the psychological space necessary for continued development, creative expression, and the kind of independent thinking that enables genuine contribution to others who are ready for authentic, rather than comfortable interaction. Breaking the approval addiction. Understanding Jung's insights about freedom and approval is only the beginning. Implementing these insights requires systematic practices that gradually reduce your dependence on external validation while building your capacity for internal authority and authentic self-expression. This process cannot be rushed because approval addiction has deep psychological roots that require patient, consistent work to transform. The practice of authentic expression. Begin with small acts of authentic self-expression that challenge your habitual accommodation of others' expectations. This might involve expressing genuine preferences about restaurants, movies, or activities, rather than automatically agreeing with others' choices. The goal is not to be difficult, but to practice accessing and expressing your authentic responses rather than suppressing them for social harmony. Pay attention to moments when you modify your natural response to gain approval or avoid conflict. Notice the physical sensation of suppressing authenticity, the tightness in your chest, the false smile, the the internal protest that you ignore to maintain social comfort. This bodily awareness helps you recognize approval-seeking patterns as they occur, rather than remaining unconscious of how frequently you betray your authentic self. Gradually increase the stakes of authentic expression by sharing opinions you know others may disagree with, establishing boundaries around your time and energy, or pursuing interests that don't align with others' expectations for your behavior. Each successful practice of authenticity builds your tolerance for others' disapproval while strengthening your connection to internal authority. The practice of solitude and self-reflection. Develop regular practices for spending time alone without entertainment, social interaction, or external stimulation that allows you to discover your authentic thoughts, feelings, and preferences without influence from others' expectations. This might involve daily meditation, journaling, walking in nature, or simply sitting quietly with your own experience. Many approval addicts cannot tolerate solitude because it eliminates the external feedback they've learned to depend on for direction and self-worth. Learning to enjoy your own company, to value your own thoughts, to trust your own judgment, requires practice that may initially feel uncomfortable, but becomes increasingly satisfying as authentic self-relationship develops. Use solitude time to explore questions about your authentic values, genuine desires, and natural responses to life circumstances without consideration of how others would judge your answers. What do you actually enjoy versus what you think you should enjoy? What are your real priorities versus what others expect your priorities to be? What would you choose if you knew no one would approve or disapprove of your choice? The practice of disappointing others. Systematically practice disappointing people when disappointment serves your authentic development or protects your legitimate interests. Begin with low-stakes disappointments, like declining optional social invitations to pursue activities that genuinely interest you, refusing requests that don't serve mutual benefit, or expressing preferences that others may not share. Pay attention to your internal responses when others express disappointment, criticism, or rejection of your authentic choices. Notice the urge to apologize for being yourself, to modify your position to regain approval, or to over-explain your decisions to justify choices that need no justification beyond your authentic preference. Practice maintaining your position despite others' negative reactions while remaining kind and respectful. The goal is not to become callous, but to develop immunity to approval-based manipulation while maintaining your capacity for genuine relationship with those who can appreciate authenticity even when they don't share your specific choices or perspectives. The practice of shadow integration. Systematically explore aspects of your personality that you've rejected or hidden to maintain social approval. This exploration requires honest self-examination of qualities you've denied possessing, behaviors you've suppressed to appear acceptable, and capabilities you've underdeveloped because others found them threatening. Begin by identifying qualities in others that trigger strong negative reactions. These often represent projected shadow material that you possess but have denied. If others' selfishness bothers you intensely, explore your own capacity for selfishness and how it might serve healthy self-care when consciously integrated. If others' aggression disturbs you, examine your own aggressive capabilities and how they might serve appropriate boundary setting and goal achievement. Practice expressing integrated shadow material in constructive ways, being appropriately selfish about protecting your time and energy, expressing appropriate aggression through assertiveness and boundary enforcement, or demonstrating appropriate independence through autonomous decision-making that doesn't require others' permission or approval. The practice of value clarification. Develop clarity about your authentic values versus inherited moral systems that you may have adopted to gain approval rather than through conscious choice based on your own experience and reflection. This involves examining every value you hold to determine whether it serves your authentic development and genuine moral understanding, or whether it represents unconscious compliance with social expectations. Ask penetrating questions about each value. Do I actually believe this, or do I think I should believe this? Does living according to this value enhance my authenticity and development, or require me to suppress aspects of myself that might be valuable if consciously integrated? Does this value serve life and growth, or does it serve social comfort and collective conformity? This process often reveals that many supposedly moral values actually serve social control rather than authentic moral development, that many ethical positions serve others' comfort rather than genuine ethical advancement, that many spiritual beliefs serve psychological dependence rather than spiritual growth. Develop new values based on your own experience, reflection, and authentic understanding of what enhances life rather than what maintains social approval. These authentic values become the foundation for independent decision-making that serves your development rather than others' expectations. The transformation from external to internal authority. The ultimate goal of breaking approval addiction is not to become indifferent to others, but to develop internal authority that enables authentic relationship with those who can appreciate your genuine self, while maintaining appropriate boundaries with those who would prefer you remain limited to versions they find comfortable and convenient. Developing internal validation system. Create robust internal systems for evaluating your choices, progress, and worth that operate independently of others' reactions or approval. This involves developing personal standards based on your authentic values, creating internal feedback mechanisms that acknowledge your growth and achievements, and building self-respect that emerges from authentic living rather than social performance. Learn to recognize the difference between genuine satisfaction that comes from authentic self-expression and the temporary relief that comes from external approval. Authentic satisfaction is more stable and lasting because it emerges from integrity between your values and actions, rather than from others' temporary positive reactions to your behavior. Develop daily and weekly practices for acknowledging your progress toward authentic living, celebrating moments when you chose authenticity over approval, recognizing growth in your capacity for independent decision-making, and appreciating your increasing ability to maintain internal authority despite external pressure. Building selective relationship skills. Learn to distinguish between relationships that support your authentic development and relationships that require your limitation as the price of maintaining connection. This discernment involves paying attention to how you feel after interacting with different people, more authentic or more performed, more energized or more drained, more respected for your genuine self, or more appreciated for your accommodating behavior. Invest increasing time and energy in relationships with people who appreciate authenticity, even when they don't share your specific perspectives, who can engage in mutual growth rather than requiring one-sided accommodation, who enhance your capacity for genuine self-expression rather than requiring persona performance for their comfort. Develop skills for maintaining appropriate relationships with those who cannot appreciate your authentic self without sacrificing your integrity or returning to accommodating patterns that serve their psychological needs more than mutual development. This might involve limiting the depth of such relationships while maintaining surface courtesy and appropriate professional or family interaction. Creating authentic life structures. Build life structures that support authentic expression rather than requiring conformity to social expectations that may not serve your genuine development. This might involve career changes that align with your authentic values rather than social status expectations, lifestyle modifications that serve your genuine preferences rather than social appearances, or relationship changes that support mutual authenticity rather than comfortable accommodation. These structural changes often require courage because they may initially reduce external approval, social status, or financial security while building internal satisfaction, authentic relationships, and psychological freedom that serve long-term well-being better than external achievements that require self-betrayal to maintain. The goal is not to reject all social participation, but to participate consciously in ways that serve your authentic development while declining participation in structures that require your limitation, self-betrayal, or accommodation of others' dysfunction as the price of inclusion. Integration and service. The culmination of breaking approval addiction is not selfish isolation, but authentic service, the capacity to contribute to others and society from wholeness rather than fragmentation, from strength rather than neediness, from authentic values rather than social expectations that may not serve genuine human development. The person who has achieved internal authority can serve others more effectively because their service emerges from conscious choice rather than compulsive people-pleasing, from genuine capability rather than desperate accommodation, from authentic care rather than fear of rejection. This authentic service often looks different from conventional helping because it serves others' genuine development rather than their comfort, their authentic growth rather than their dysfunctional patterns, their long-term well-being rather than their immediate gratification or approval needs. The individuated person becomes a model of authentic living that may inspire others to pursue their own individuation journey while respecting their choice to remain embedded in collective patterns if that represents their authentic developmental stage rather than imposed limitation. Jung's ultimate truth. Carl Jung's ultimate truth about freedom and approval culminates in a recognition that may initially seem harsh, but ultimately proves liberating. Your desperate need for others' approval is not love, but psychological dependency that prevents you from developing the authentic self-worth and genuine relationships that make life meaningful and satisfying. The person who breaks free from approval addiction discovers that authentic relationships, connections based on mutual respect for individual authenticity rather than comfortable accommodation of limitation, provide far more satisfaction than approval-based relationships ever could. These authentic connections are more rare, but infinitely more valuable because they support genuine development rather than requiring mutual constraint. You also discover that internal authority, the capacity to make decisions based on your authentic values and understanding rather than social pressure, creates more reliable happiness than external approval because it cannot be withdrawn by others when you make choices they don't understand or support. Internal authority provides stable psychological foundation that external approval can never supply. Perhaps most importantly, you discover that authentic self-expression, living according to your genuine nature rather than performing for others' comfort, creates more meaningful life satisfaction than social conformity because it allows access to your complete capabilities rather than limiting you to socially acceptable fragments of your potential. The journey from approval addiction to authentic freedom is not easy because it requires courage that most people lack, the courage to be disliked for being yourself rather than loved for being what others want you to be, the courage to disappoint those who prefer your limitation to your liberation, the courage to accept temporary loneliness while authentic relationships develop. But Jung understood that this courage serves not just individual development, but collective evolution, because each person who breaks free from approval-based limitation becomes a possibility model for others who may be ready to begin their own individuation journey. Your freedom demonstrates that alternatives to collective conformity exist and can be achieved by those willing to pay the price of authentic living. The price Jung identified is clear. If you want freedom, you must stop seeking approval. This doesn't mean becoming cruel or indifferent to others, but rather developing sufficient internal authority that others' reactions become interesting information rather than determining factors in your self-worth and decision-making. You can appreciate others' approval when it's offered genuinely while not needing it for psychological stability. You can consider others' perspectives while trusting your own judgment. You can maintain relationships while refusing to sacrifice your authenticity for others' comfort. This is Jung's truth. Freedom and approval seeking cannot coexist because freedom requires the courage to be yourself, regardless of others' reactions, while approval seeking requires the willingness to modify yourself according to others' preferences. The choice is binary. You can be free, or you can be universally approved, but you cannot be both. Choose freedom. Choose authenticity. Choose the difficult path of individuation that leads to genuine self-respect, authentic relationships, and the kind of life satisfaction that emerges from integrity rather than accommodation. Your authentic self, The person you are when you stop performing for others' approval is waiting for you to develop the courage to let them emerge despite the social costs such emergence requires. This authentic self contains your greatest gifts, your deepest satisfaction, and your most meaningful contribution to others who are ready for authenticity rather than comfortable illusions. If you want freedom, you must stop seeking approval. Begin now. Your authentic life is waiting on the other side of your willingness to disappoint those who prefer your limitation to your liberation. The journey begins when approval-seeking ends. Begin the journey. Claim your freedom. Discover who you actually are when you stop trying to be who others want you to be. Jung's truth awaits your courage to live it. If you want freedom, you must stop seeking approval.